U.S. agriculture is undergoing a major transition, with Brazil gaining ground in global soybean market share and trade tensions reshaping export flows. U.S. policymakers have turned to biofuels as a way to bolster domestic demand and support farm prices. But can renewable fuels really make up for lost exports? And what does this shift mean for soybeans, a crop that once dominated world markets? I'm Johanna Bota, and joining me today to break down the near and long-term outlook for U.S. soybean demand, biofuels, and global trade is Arlan Suderman, Chief Commodities Officer at StoneX. Welcome, Arlan.
It's good to be back with you again.
Yes, and Happy New Year. So,
Happy New Year.
Let's begin with the shift in global competition. With Brazil expanding its footprint, how is U.S. soybean demand changing?
Well, certainly Brazil has the cost advantage. The United States is no longer the low-cost producer in the world, frankly, of most commodities anymore. When you have Brazil in particular that can grow 2 and maybe even 3 crops a year on the same ground, that certainly gives it an advantage. And then when you look at the strength of the U.S. dollar versus the weakness of the Brazilian real, and many of the other countries who also compete with us on the export market, the weakness of their currencies, it's going to be easier to purchase their products and do the currency conversion. So the United States is no longer the low-cost producer. And so the biofuel program is a part of trying to add value to commodities so that we can be less reliant on bulk commodity exports and more on domestic consumption and export of value-added products.
So let's stay on the revised U.S. biofuel program. Do you think that it could be a real lifeline and actually shift soybean demand dynamics?
It actually, really could. And it comes down to the will of the government here. And let's be honest about it. This is government picking winners and losers. This is also governments subsidizing their food production system. All countries basically do it in one way or the other. In the past, we basically supported exports and growth for exports to keep a healthy food production system in place. That's becoming more difficult to do. So we're choosing to build a domestic program to consume our products in order to keep our food production system healthy. There is a cost to that. The taxpayer is helping foot the bill for that, but that is the way in which the government's doing it. The potential is very significant there, not just for domestic demand for fuel, but for global demand for fuel, because there are many countries around the world that are much more advanced in their desire for biofuels than even in the United States. So the potential is there if the government's willing to do the subsidies, and this administration currently is.
So I guess the question really is, can biofuels realistically offset lost soybean exports to China?
Not this year, but in the future they can. And I think that's part of the objective of the trade deal with China. That handshake trade deal from October 30th is basically an agreement to buy more expensive U.S. ag commodities, namely soybeans, in return for having access to the U.S. consumer market. Do we expect China to fully live up to that agreement? Well, initially, yes, but longer term, no. But it does help bridge the gap to allow time, 2 to 3 years, to build up the biofuel infrastructure within the United States.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the last time I checked, China had bought 10 million tons out of the 12 million tons that had been promised to buy. So it's almost there, I would say. So what does rising U.S. biofuel demand mean for global vegetable oil markets?
Well, it certainly strengthens it because it's not just the United States that's moving in this direction. You look at Indonesia going to 50% use of palm oil, 50% use of, blending in its biodiesel program using palm oil that it produces domestically, pulling that supply from the world market. You look at what Brazil is doing, increasing its biodiesel blending mandate. And even going to E30 for ethanol consumption. Many countries around the world are increasing. So we are increasing demand for these oilseed products, which is also a food product as well. And so we are strengthening that demand globally and pushing prices upward.
Now, Arlan, before we wrap up, looking at the bigger picture, do soybeans still lead the agricultural markets, or are they starting to look more like a rotation crop, you think?
Well, soybeans definitely lead in Brazil. That's their crop of choice, with corn being more of a rotational crop with it. In the United States, it's more corn being the dominant crop, with soybeans being a rotational crop. That said, there's still an advantage for having soybeans in rotation with corn, alternating every other year. So farmers here will continue to grow soybeans. So that makes it incumbent upon the marketplace to then find a demand source for it. And right now, biofuel is that primary option available. But I do think it's incumbent upon the United States to use its technology capabilities to develop more domestic markets, value-added markets, so that we can be less dependent upon exports.
Arlan, thank you so much again for joining us. And thank you to our viewers for watching. For more financial content, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel.